Okay, this is pretty different. I was sure Jane would say no when I asked her if I could interview her. I mean, she is my wife. She's actually upstairs, and I'm down here on the main floor, so it'll say Jane Roy on both of our cameras. But she kindly consented to do so, and Jane, I appreciate it. This is kind of a first for us. I did think it was a good idea, though, because this is 36 years ago we had our first spring food drive, right? And I remember those days. We had no idea what we were doing and all the things that we had to learn. But it's been a long, long time, and we've been through a lot of changes as a food bank in the course of that. So I thought it might be good to talk about the food drive, what it means to us. And are you good with that?
I am totally good with it. But
Sure.
if we started 36 years ago with not knowing what we were doing, what's exactly changed?
Yeah, no, I know. And that's especially true in this last year, right? Like, I think we honestly thought that after COVID kind of dissipated and ended, things to some degree would get back to normal. Everybody thought that. It didn't matter what aspect of life that they were in, and it just didn't. But especially for food banks, that is really true. It didn't go at all the way that we thought that it was going to. The challenges we faced in COVID, which was huge, and you were the one that managed so much of that, Jane. You had to go down to the food bank and split them into two teams, and you had to run it all like that for 2 years. So that was a huge amount of changes, not only for the food bank, but for us as a family. And then my job was out in the community, yours was at the food bank. But I think you and I were kind of looking forward to that part of it ending, and then all of a sudden things have changed a lot this year. What do you think has been the main thing that's changed or has challenged you, because you're the one down at the food bank in this last year since COVID has ended and food banks are obviously challenged? What's the main challenge for you?
I think the biggest challenge is I'm just the numbers of people needing our help, right? And that kind of magnifies everything. For so many years, we've kind of hovered around, 3,000 families a month, sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less, generally between 3,000 and 3,500. And now, we hit 5,000 families in the month of March, and that's at the food bank. So I think that's probably been the biggest challenge, because it's just more, and more creates a lot of stress, particularly on the volunteers or the people that are down there. So I think, the volunteers are the ones who have actually really stepped up and done an amazing job. But it means more food. It means we're spending more money. It means more trucks going out. It means there's more volunteers helping. And when one or two of them can't come because they, let's say, get a little sick themselves, or they're now starting to go on vacation, we're having to fill more and more gaps. And I think that's been both a challenge and kind of, the exciting part is that people are stepping up. The difficult emotional part is that so many more people need the help, and it's just, I don't see an end in sight. That part is very discouraging.
Yeah, over 3 decades ago, you and I were founding members of what was then called the Ontario Food Bank Association. It's now Feed Ontario. We were also founding members of Food Banks Canada, right? So we've been around a long time. But one of the things that we really struck off on early that we wanted to do is that we really wanted to be volunteer-based. So I was a firefighter at the time, as you remember, and we weren't married then or anything, but we at that point, I didn't know what was going to happen, and I ended up being a volunteer co-director of the food bank for 27 years. Right? You came on in that first year and you volunteered. This is back in 1986. You came along and you volunteered for the first year totally as a volunteer. And then we brought you on as staff at that point. But I do think that really imprinted our organization. Now, fast forward 36 years, and now we have like 8 or 9 staff. You've hired a couple of extra this last while to deal with the pressures, but still, compared to other food banks our size, we have a very small staff. Do you have any regrets about that, Jane? Do you kind of wish we would have had a larger staff so it could have been prepared for the COVID stuff and the stuff that happened? What's your view on that?
Well, my view has always been that the individual matters, and that, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to care. It just requires citizens to step up. So I've never regretted any of that. I do think, though, the level upon which we are operating now, it's beyond my gifts and abilities. Like, it does require more management
Yeah.
And that's, I'm not a manager. I'm just a show up and help out kind of person. I think I think most of us have stepped up to manage, obviously, because we've needed to do that. But most of the larger food banks you talk about have gone through this transition like years ago because they reached a point, and it did require more management kind of principles and more management styles, just because you're dealing with so many people and so many personalities and so much food. And but I never regret, and I've never regretted, and I hope we always maintain that, because there is always a place for people like you and I, Glenn. We're not experts, but we want to make a difference, and I think we've done it. And I do think most of the volunteers at the food bank are feeling exactly the same way.
Yeah, and I mean, we've got over 3,000 volunteers in our database for the food bank. So I do think that continues to inspire us, right? Like if we were stuck for volunteers, then really you have to depend on staff a lot, maybe even hiring more staff. But when I think of COVID and how many people came and volunteered with us through COVID and what they're doing now, it's pretty easy to keep it still largely as a volunteer organization, right? And so I do think that the public has been and organizations and others. You and I were out at a thing on the weekend with people who own Dodge Ram trucks, right? And what they were doing is that they were at grocery stores for the food drive on Saturday. So you and I went out to No Frills, and we were out there talking to them, and they were using their trucks. They just decided, a bunch of them, I think they had 20 trucks, and they decided that what they were going to do is just go to grocery stores and try to collect for the food bank. And you were there when they came in. I think it was on Sunday yesterday. So I mean, when you see that, it is pretty inspiring, right? And then even just before that, you had a group of pretty special young girls that came down to the food bank who you encountered. What happened there?
So I think, over the years, we haven't advertised. People come to us wanting to help. Mm-hmm. In terms of that. So we're always managing people's generosity already. And a few months ago, a parent of one of the girls, and you're talking about the Goodness Angels, came down to visit me, saying, there's 8 young women who wanted to get back and maybe do a food drive or do something. We talked through all sorts of processes. And so they ran a food drive for the first time into January, February, and they brought the food down, and we met them, and they were wonderful young women. They were from Turkey. Their families had been refugees or immigrated from Turkey, and they've come all at different times. Everything from their families arrived 10 years ago to, just recently or a few years ago. So I think, the fact that they came and wanted to give back, and the community had opened their arms to them. They were also very touched by how people reacted to the earthquakes in Turkey and Syria and wanting to give. So that made them want to do something for Canadians, right, within Canada as well, and within people within Canada. So a wonderful group of young ladies for sure.
And I think what's wonderful about that is we put it out in a 2-minute video on Facebook. You took the video, right? And it was great. And then they were so positive and so great that we had them at the press conference last week for the food drive. And of course, that's who the media was really interested in. I think they get so tired of seeing you and me. They were really interested in that group, and it was wonderful. And then, they got in the Free Press, they had other interviews, and then this morning they were on CBC, right? And I think that says not just something about them, but it says something about the community, that the community sees something like that and puts real value in it. In fact, there were over 2,000 hits just on that story about them, right? And I think that's the kind of community we live in. They love this kind of value-driven stuff. They like to believe that just average people can just come down and make that kind of difference. And I think that that's really true. And in this food drive, Jane, we chose to focus on 2 key things. I wanted to focus on food security, which was the idea of, and we'll get into it next week, but the idea of we have enough food for everybody in this community, and it's affordable, and it's local, and it's fresh. That's what we want to fight for. But the other thing we wanted to do was just have a thank you campaign, which is what this is. So we had the press conference, and you led it, and you spoke about it. But why the thank you campaign, and why now when we're under all of this pressure? Why that?
Well, I think there's a few different reasons for it. I think it's, when you talk about these young women, the goodness angels that came down and donated, that speaks to the people that have been to us. They came because they were refugees, they're immigrants, and they've actually, their families have used food bank type services or food bank services. And they've it's not that they've cycled through, but they've established roots. They're part of the community. They've got jobs and they want to give back. And sometimes when people think about the people that come to the food bank, it's easy to get prejudiced about either folks who have been on assistance for a long time or new Canadians kind of coming down. And I think seeing people work their way through it and then give back is really important. So the ability for them and for people to say thank you is huge. I think the second thing is when the pandemic hit, we weren't sure what was going to happen, obviously. Food wasn't given into the same degree by the public, but money definitely was over the past couple of years. And I think we have been as successful as we have been because the public has been so generous. And that's individuals, that's corporations, it's business cares, it's food groups, it's all sorts of people giving to the food bank. And I think it's important for us to consistently say thank you and not always present. It's important for us to present the opportunity for people to give, but to constantly talk about a need that has to be fulfilled can get very difficult. And I think we also understand that with inflation or with things difficult, it's just as difficult on the donors. So the ability to say you've also given, and this is what's actually helping to sustain us right now, I think is important. And to say thank you. I mean, we've heard of stories, and it's generally the smaller food banks. Some of the smaller food banks over the pandemic had to close due to some lack of resources. And it wasn't just the food that wasn't coming in; it was actually their volunteers. They had been older. And they just couldn't come in anymore, and it was really difficult. So to be able to say, look, in the midst of all that, Londoners have been amazing and wonderful, and we're as solid as we ever were. So I think it's important to say thank you and to acknowledge that.
Yeah, and I mean, that is the big difference for food banks now as opposed to other years, right? Like back in 81 or 82 when the first food bank started, it was on the heels of a recession, and it was in Edmonton, Alberta. So they started the first food bank. You and I were here for a couple of years after that to start up the London one. But I do think that after every recession, the numbers of people coming to food banks increased. And it was like all of a sudden governments and others didn't feel as inclined to continue to apply themselves to the poverty situation. They were just content to get through the recession and get on with things. But I think with COVID and what happened, it seems to me what's really different this time than all of those other times when there were economic challenges is that this one really has hit the donor. It's different this time, right? They're having to pay more for food. They're having to pay more for rent. They're having to pay more for fuel, all of those things. And I think moving into it, that's part of the reason why we wanted to say thanks. We didn't want to put more pressure on them. It was more to say, look, we get it. And the fact is, in the last year, they've still given a whopping amount of stuff to us, right? Mm-hmm. It's an amazing thing when you consider all the pressure they've been under, right?
Well, no, it's huge for sure. I mean, I don't know that we've ever faced this. I shouldn't say we've ever. I don't know historically, but I know in my lifetime we haven't faced this kind of inflation that has stuck around and hit the pocketbooks. There are definitely some generational things kind of happening, and it's difficult. But again, it's difficult for so many people, and because they themselves are feeling it, they also understand that others are going through it and are wanting to show up. And I think, again, that's the whole testament to people trying to make a difference. And I found for me going through the pandemic, it actually helped to focus me on the things that mattered a little bit more. So I think that's one of the things people are understanding. Other charities had some difficulty. For sure, they had to close down, but those of us that were involved in the basic needs, flourished in that context because people gave and people made sure that their neighbors were taken care of. So, we've been the benefit. The people we serve have been the real beneficiary of that.
Mm-hmm. One of the advantages of living in London is not just the compassion of the public, but organizations, faith groups, service clubs, all of those, that they all organize schools, all that stuff happens, but also the business community. In a lot of cities, well, in every city across the country, businesses give a lot to food banks. But in London, they're organized. And that's under Business Cares and Wayne Dunn. And you're largely the food bank liaison with Wayne when that stuff all comes up at Christmas time. But I think that too was just so generous this past Christmas, right? It got us through. But do you, like, I wondered this, I remember a couple of weeks ago, we've been so lucky to be in London and direct a food bank in London, but there are other food banks in other communities that are either having to ration or thinking of closing. And sometimes we've just been so lucky here that we forget that for food banks in general, this is a really tough time. I know that you're on a committee that works with the Ontario food banks through Feed Ontario, but are you sensing that from others as well, that the pressures are almost getting to be unbearable?
Well, I think, I think for sure amongst some of the smaller food banks did close and they had some real pressures, obviously. I think that some of the larger food banks are so large that the pressures to maintain that have been so difficult. So when you think of someplace like Toronto, you're talking, I think when they went into the pandemic, they were probably spending, I think I remember a few $100,000 a month on food. Well, they spend probably almost $1 million a month on food. They're spending $12 million to $13, $14 million a year. The numbers of people they're serving, we serve maybe 13,000 families a month. They're up at 300,000. And I can't imagine what it's like in Toronto. They've really been able to integrate things. So I think the larger food banks that are really and not just well organized, but they've got such a large population they're taking care of. I think they're really definitely feeling the stress and wondering how they're going to continue. When they talk about rationing, some of those have pulled back, but they were helping, every couple of weeks, and they've pulled back to kind of once a month or some of those kind of things. So I think that's been, again, one of the difficult things. The larger cities have definitely faced huge challenges, particularly when it comes to some of the housing costs. And that just reflects in then food bank usage, which reflects then in the difficulties that the food banks had to maintain the levels of support for people who need it.
Do you feel, as I do, you and I were just up 2-3 weeks ago in Toronto for meetings at Queen's Park with provincial MPPs, with provincial politicians, and there were some people who were clients of food banks who spoke, and it was very moving, but also some food bank directors spoke and talked about that they're kind of reaching the end, that things are kind of crashing in. Do you get the sense, like I do, we haven't talked about this, but that we're kind of getting disconnected from public policy? Do you feel that? I think in the past, there was always the sense that, yes, maybe governments weren't doing as much as some hoped that they would, but they were taking part in programs and making sure things were there. And food banks were kind of partnering with that to take the rough edge off of social programs. But now it just feels to me, anyway, that governments are farther away from that the problem has really become more at a community level, that groups have not been able to count on government as much. I know other food bank directors feel the same. I sure do. Do you?
I think I'm not smart enough in many ways on the public policy things. I think there are a lot of things that people don't always access. And I do think all the levels of government always need to work together. But I think what I really feel is we've kind of become the adjunct social services, and it was always, that you went to a food bank, there was always the belief that other things should take care, there should be enough. And the food banks, it's not that they were temporary, not temporary. They were there to help you in through a bit of a crisis. And we were an emergency service, but those emergency services are so chronic, it's not emergency anymore. People need us basically kind of all the time. And I know that there's, yes, the percentage of new folks who have never been to a food bank before has gone up, but it really feels like, we've just become part of society and where everybody goes. And it's not I think there's always been a place for food banks for when a family goes through that, and it's that they kind of cycle through a little bit till they get on their feet. But it just doesn't feel like this. This feels like it's going to be this way for forever. So I find that discouraging. That, it used to be we were busiest towards the end of the month. When people had some source of income and they trailed, they waited till that ran out and then they came to us for help. Well, today is April 3rd. It's the first day of the month for us in the concept, and we're probably 300 families today. Like, we're busy every day. And the beginning of the month is sometimes even worse towards the end, and people come to us to see what they get so then they can go grocery shopping. And that's important that they do it, but we're not an emergency. We're not emergency anymore. It's just because there's so many emergencies. And I think that's very difficult.
And I don't know a food bank director across the country, and we know many. I don't know of one that likes that. I think they all realize, stop it. Stop depending so much on food banks. Have proper policies that will help. And I know you say that, you're not so much into the policy side as the immediate side, but it's true that on the immediate side, we're now seeing people who are ODSP, people who are on Ontario Works, right? A whole bunch of people who in the past had strong government supports. That's also true for people who are homeless, and the homeless lunch program that you and I put together at the food bank. I mean, that was a lot, but because there was a failure at government levels to be able to handle it. So I think it's important that people realize that food bank directors are not sitting there saying, hey, we want to become the big kids on the block. That's not the case. And we say that whenever we have the regional meetings or the national meetings or the provincial meetings. It's really true, but it's happening, and it's going that way, and more people are falling through not just the cracks in the social safety net, but massive holes, and they're falling through. And I just think it's a really difficult time for those of us. It is for me, it is for you, who are sitting there trying to think after over 3 decades, when does it turn the corner? When does it get better? We're supposed to be here plugging the holes, helping in emergency, but it seems to be getting worse every year. Is that part of the discouragement you're facing?
Well, I think so. I mean, we're talking about the discouragement for us, but then I think it's, 5,000 families, those are individuals and those are families. I mean, I think that magnifies the discouragement. I mean, I think last year 36% had never been to a food bank before. You're talking people like you and I, Glenn, who end up having to come to a food bank. I think that's really discouraging. And it just kind of continues to magnify. So for whatever discouragement we face, it's nothing compared to what people are kind of facing and trying to navigate the rules. When you talk about the folks and they were 2 senior women who came to speak to us and at Queen's Park and came to speak to the MPPs. They were talking how difficult it was to actually get on and access disability because they had an RSP or because they had other things. And it took months and months and months, and they drained through all their savings. And the next thing you know, they were destitute, and the healthcare costs were huge for them. So I think that's the stuff that I also found really, really discouraging.
Yeah. I sometimes worry for you. I think I get more discouraged than you do, but I sometimes worry for you because you're down at the food bank every day with the staff and with the volunteers, and you're seeing the effects of our failures of being able to put this together. On the other hand, I'm out there in the community, and the community is having food drives, so they'll have us speak and want to help or whatever it is. There's a lot of positive stuff there. But I've always been amazed that you were able to keep your spirit up there and going, because you, more than me, face much more of the challenges that are out there. Have there been days where you felt it was too much, or have you overall been able to stay on top of it?
I think one of the differences, though, Glenn, is over the past years, the community's actually come into the food bank. So I think I see all of those same things. That I see the food drive coming in. I see people wanting to give us cash. I see people wanting to talk to me. I see the volunteers, and I think that's been really difficult. I said, so that's not been difficult. That's been great. Sorry. and helps with the difficulty. I think it tends to be more when I sit down and just think about all the things that have to be done around organizing it, or just sitting down and watching the people come in and then watching the volunteers deal with them as kindly as they can. It's just, you can't do we give food. that's what we give, and people go home, but they're still stuck within their lives. I think when I sit down and think about that's when it becomes really kind of discouraging.
Well, that's a great answer that you just gave, because it's true. Many people say that the food bank is at the heart of community, but it's also true the community is at the heart of the food bank. Just like the Goodness Angels, right? Like, you were really excited when you interviewed them. I could tell, boy, you were in a good mood that day. It was great for you to be able.
They were great.
Yeah, no, it's really true. And this food drive is really about that. I wanted to call it the 8-letter campaign, just because thank you is 8 letters. And just to say that, with the food, what the London community has done for the London Food Bank in this last year that is so challenging for every food bank across the country has been remarkable. And the last thing they need is for us to say, hey, it's desperate, you need to give more, or whatever it is. And we've just decided not to do that. We haven't set targets. We're not asking people to do it. We're leaving it up to them. And we did that too at Christmas time. We left it up to them, and they came up with all of those donations. Like, it really is amazing. It's kind of like we don't feel as directors that we need to prime the pump. People just need to know that there's an opportunity, and they just give. It's true, isn't it? Like, it happens every day.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's about being partners, and it's not about them providing a need we have. It's about being partners and being able to serve folks. That's definitely true.
Yeah. So you and I have been co-directors for a long, long time, and it's interesting to have a husband and wife team that are that way, right? And I've always been in awe of you, of your abilities, but I think that is something that I will always regard as special about the food bank. We always believed in equality. You and I work in Sudan with women's programs, and we're trying to help people there to run them like that, to let women have that place. It's been a very difficult thing for us. But when I look at the food bank, Jane, it's been a great thing for you and me, obviously, but also the idea of equality, of men and women working together in those roles and understanding their gifts and talents. I think it has been a remarkable thing. And you see it at our board, in the mixture on our board. You see it in the volunteers as well. But, we can talk about equality, and that's very important that we do, but we can also live it out, and we do. But I think the role that you have played in all of that, Jane, has been really amazing. And you've been there from the very beginning. It was you volunteering for that first year when I was a firefighter back in 1986 that kept the doors open and kept it working. So I think that's really amazing. However, I'm still really big on food security.
Yeah. Yep.
Let's turn the tables a bit. Do you mind? How about next week you interview me? Why don't we do that, and we'll talk about food security, because that's the other side of what we're trying to do on this food drive, and I think people need to know what that is. It's tough to know the difference between food security and food insecurity. Yep. Maybe you and I can talk about that and why the food bank is trying so hard with other organizations to create that food security. Are you up for that?
For sure. Are you ready to be grilled?
You won't ask me anything embarrassing or anything.
Not at all.
Anyway, Jane, I have always delighted in food drives. They've been the most delightful time for us in the way that the public always responds, and organizations and businesses. They've always responded. And this year, they're doing exactly the same thing. You were reporting on that yesterday, and you will again today. It's wonderful for you and I. It's always like we're always on the crest of the wave of that, and that wave is being produced by the community compassion that's out there. I've loved that, serving with you and doing that for community. It's been great for us to do it for a long time, Jane. So it's really awesome. So thank you for that privilege.
And I look forward to talking to you next week.
Yeah, don't embarrass me. And what I'll do is I'll put the kettle on now. You come on downstairs. We'll have a tea and talk about how this went. Thanks for doing this, Jane.
Take care.
This program is brought to you by Ignite TV. Now you're in command. Visit Rogers.com for more details.